In November 2021, Nike was worth $179 per share, its all-time high, and it controlled practically every shelf in every sports store on the planet. We're talking about the most powerful brand in global sports, with over $50 billion in annual revenue, a machine that had spent decades crushing anyone who dared to compete. 3 years later, on June 28, 2024, Nike lost $28 billion in value in a single trading day, the worst day in 44 years on the stock market. And the most brutal part isn't the fall. It's that nobody pushed them. While two brands that almost nobody knew, Running and Hoka, were taking over the throne Nike abandoned on its own. It wasn't a competitor, it wasn't a crisis, it wasn't a scandal. Nike did this to itself. Strategic self-destruction. When the very system that made you invincible is exactly what you decide to dismantle piece by piece. Because that's exactly what Nike did. Dismantle, piece by piece, the three pillars that turned it into the greatest sports empire in the world. And it did so voluntarily. To understand how a company self-destructs, you need to understand what made it invincible. Nike wasn't just a sneaker brand. It was a system. A system built on three pillars that worked like gears: constant innovation, omnipresent physical presence, and an authentic sports culture that connected with anyone who'd ever set foot on a court. In innovation, Nike had no rival. It was the company that invented air technology, an air chamber inside the sole that cushioned every step, that developed Flyknit, an ultra-thin fabric that wrapped around the foot like a sock, but with the structure of a shoe, and that in 2017 launched the Vaporfly, shoes with a carbon fiber plate, an ultralight material used in Formula One cars, that literally made professional athletes run faster. So much so, there was debate about whether they should be banned. In distribution, Nike was everywhere, from the sports store in your neighborhood to the department stores, through specialized chains like Foot Locker or Dick's Sporting Goods. And in culture, Nike was the sport itself. Michael Jordan, Tiger Woods, Serena Williams, Cristiano Ronaldo. If you were the best in the world at something, you wore Nike. Those three pillars fed each other, Car. Innovation created product, the stores put it in front of the customer, and the culture made choosing Nike automatic. Break one and the others hold. But if you break all three at once... And that's exactly what happened in January 2020, when Nike put a man named John Donahoe in charge. Donahoe didn't come from sports. He came from eBay, the online auction platform, where he'd been CEO, the top boss of the company, for 7 years. And before that, from Bain & Company, a consulting firm that charges millions to tell big companies how to reorganize. He was a Silicon Valley man, the area of California where the big tech companies are born, all about data and algorithms. And Nike hired him because it wanted to become more than a sneaker company. It wanted to be a tech company. The idea wasn't absurd on paper. Amazon was devouring traditional brick-and-mortar stores. The pandemic had just accelerated online shopping, and Nike thought the future was in selling directly to consumers through its website and apps. They called it Consumer Direct Acceleration. Basically, cut out the middleman and keep the entire margin. That is, the difference between what it costs to make a sneaker and what the customer pays for it, without splitting that money with any store. But Donahoe did something that changed Nike's destiny forever. For the direct-to-consumer strategy to work, he decided they had to eliminate the middlemen, and he started cutting. In August 2020, first wave, Nike stopped selling at Belk, Dillard's, Zappos, and 6 other chains. In 2021, second wave, out with DSW, out with Urban Outfitters, out with Macy's for apparel, out with Shoe Show, out with Olympia Sports. By September 2021, Nike's own chief financial officer, the person in charge of the accounts, said it at a conference. We've exited approximately 50% of our retail partners. Retail, meaning the stores that sell directly to the public. Half. Nike voluntarily abandoned half of the stores where its products were sold.
And here's the trap. Nike assumed its customers were loyal to the brand. But most people bought Nike because it was there. How in the store they were already going to. Turns out convenience beats loyalty. Who would have thought?
Meanwhile, Donahoe committed the second fatal error, and this one was equally devastating. Instead of investing in innovation and creating new product, he decided to milk the classics. Nike had 3 iconic sneakers, the Dunk, the Air Force 1, and the Jordan 1, that were relatively cheap to produce because the designs had existed since the 80s. Donahoe flooded the market with them. In 2024, the Dunk alone represented 18% of all Nike footwear sales, nearly $6 billion from a single retro model. The problem is that when you produce millions of units of the same sneaker, you stop being exclusive and start being boring. Consumers got tired, and Nike had nothing new waiting for them because Donahoe had cut investment in R&D, meaning research and development of new products. Donahoe himself ended up admitting that innovation had stalled, though he blamed it on remote work and video calls, as if creativity needed an office to function. And the third pillar, sports culture, collapsed on its own. Because when your CEO comes from eBay and not from sports, the priorities change. Donahoe reorganized Nike by product categories instead of by sport. There was no longer a team dedicated to running, another to basketball, another to soccer. Now, everything was managed by gender: men's, women's, kids. Sounds efficient on paper, but in practice, it meant that the people who truly understood runners, basketball players, lost their voice. Nike went from speaking the language of the athlete to speaking the language of Excel. And when it laid off 1,500 employees in February 2024 as part of a $2 billion cost-cutting plan, many of them veterans who'd been with the company for decades, the signal was clear. This is no longer the Nike we knew. And this is where the story gets really dark, because those shelves Nike left empty in thousands of stores didn't stay empty for long. 2 brands that almost nobody knew were about to pull off the move of their lives. On Running, a Swiss company founded in 2010 by a former Ironman champion who started by gluing pieces of garden hose to the bottom of his shoes, and Hoka, created in 2009 in the French Alps by 2 mountain runners obsessed with cushioning. Neither of them had Nike's budget or its star athletes. But they had something Nike no longer had: new product on the right shelves. And the most ironic part is, they didn't need to be better than Nike. They just needed to be where Nike no longer was. Bernhard turned that garden hose hack into Cloud Tech, his star cushioning technology. And in 2019, he signed Roger Federer as investor and co-entrepreneur, betting the tennis star's name on a brand that almost nobody knew outside the running world. Hoka, for its part, went from making mountain shoes in an alpine garage to being in every running store on the planet. While Nike was cutting innovation, On and Hoka were investing in cushioning technology. While Nike was abandoning stores, they were filling their shelves. And while Nike was living off designs from the 80s, they were winning over professional runners. In 2024, On Running brought in $2.3 billion, 28% more than the previous year, and Hoka reached $2.2 billion, with 24% growth. Two brands that didn't exist 10 years ago were now bringing in over $4.5 billion combined, growing at 25% per year, while Nike was falling 12%.
And now comes the most painful part of this story. Because when Nike realized it had made a mistake, it was already too late to stop it.
And then came the final blow. On June 28, 2024, Nike released its earnings and announced that sales would drop between 8 and 10% the following quarter, when analysts were expecting a 1% increase. Wall Street panicked, and the stock plunged 20% in a single session, evaporating $28 billion in value, the worst day in Nike's stock market history. Dunk sales, the model that had been the golden goose, collapsed. From nearly $6 billion in 2024 to a forecast of just $1.75 billion, a 70% drop in 2 years. And Converse, another brand in the group, fell an additional 18%. By December 2024, Nike's stock had lost value 4 years in a row, something that had never happened in its history. Nike's board of directors, the group of people who oversee the CEO, did what it should have done sooner. In September 2024, it announced that John Donahoe was leaving, and it chose his replacement the only way that made sense: by looking inside. Elliott Hill had joined Nike in 1988 at 24 years old as an intern. Over 32 years, he held 19 different positions, from salesman to regional director, from Europe to North America, until he retired as president of consumer in 2020, right when Donahoe arrived. Now Nike was calling him back to undo exactly what Donahoe had done.
And here's a lesson worth its weight in gold. When the company was dying, we knew we had to find a way to make it relevant again. They didn't go looking for another Silicon Valley genius. They went for the guy who'd been selling sneakers door to door for 3 decades. Because the problem was never technological, it was about identity.
Hill started rebuilding from day one. He brought back the structure organized by sports, running, basketball, soccer, each with its own team. Went out to reconnect with the stores Donahoe had abandoned. Wholesale sales rose 8% in his second quarter, and launched Nike Skims with Kim Kardashian to win back the women's market. He unveiled new innovations, a shoe with a motorized system and designs based on neuroscience, to prove that Nike can still do things no one else can. But he himself admitted that the damage is going to take time to repair. And the tariffs of 2026, the taxes the US government puts on products made overseas, are going to cost an additional $1.5 billion, an extra blow nobody expected. As of today, Nike trades at around $55, 70% below its all-time high of $179.
And here's where we draw out the lessons you can apply to your business today. First lesson: don't copy another industry's playbook without understanding what makes yours unique. Donahoe applied the logic of eBay and Amazon to a brand whose real value was in the shelves and in sports culture, and he destroyed both.
Because what worked for an online auction platform, cutting out middlemen, automating everything, optimizing with data, was poison for a company that sold identity and emotion. Nike wasn't Amazon. People didn't buy sneakers the way they buy batteries.
Second lesson, when you abandon a distribution channel, you don't get that space back. Someone else fills it. And it's going to cost you 10 times more to come back than it cost you to stay.
On and Hoka didn't win because they were better. They won because they showed up. The consumer who walked into Foot Locker and didn't find Nike didn't go home to search Nike.com. They tried on whatever was next to them. That simple. That brutal.
Third lesson, a premium brand that enters permanent discounts stops being premium. And rebuilding that perception of value takes years.
Nike overproduced millions of dunks, couldn't sell them online as expected, and started liquidating them with aggressive markdowns. Every discount eroded the exclusivity they'd built over decades. Because a sneaker on permanent sale is no longer an object of desire. It's merchandise.
Fourth lesson, living off past hits is renting time, not buying future. If you don't innovate in parallel, when the classics run dry, you'll have nothing behind them.
The Dunks brought in $6 billion easy dollars until they stopped. And when consumers got bored, Nike didn't have a single new model that could replace them.
And fifth lesson, a leader who doesn't understand the soul of their product can optimize the company to death. If you bring in someone from the outside to modernize, make sure they understand what NOT to change.
Because if you get that wrong, it can cost you $180 billion. Donahoe improved everything that could be measured, the data, the digital, the efficiency, and destroyed everything that can't be measured, the culture, the innovation, the human relationships with the stores. The quarterly numbers went up while the building was coming down.
So the next time you think about transforming your business, ask yourself this question. Are you improving the system that made you great? Or are you dismantling it? Because that answer can be the difference between an empire and ruins.